Today on the show, we are very fortunate to have Debbie Irving, who is the author of Waking Up White, her first book after years of being a teacher. And Debbie speaks about her experience and her journey from becoming unaware and well-meaning, well-intentioned, to becoming more racially aware and well-doing. And I want to share the quote that her husband shared with us when he said, "It couldn't have happened to a more whiter person." I don't know if I got that right.
Couldn't have happened to a whiter person.
There you go.
Yeah.
You should know.
Right.
Thank you for being on.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
This is so exciting. You've spent a lot of time in Wellesley lately.
I have.
In the last 2 weeks.
There's a striking similarity between Wellesley and the town I grew up in, Winchester, Massachusetts. Yeah.
So tell us about how you grew up and how this started and how this journey started for you.
So I refer to Winchester as a white bubble, meaning it was, through my eyes, exclusively white. It turns out there were a few families of color there, but to me it was white, even though I wouldn't have described it that way at the time. This was just life to me. And it was reflected back to me in not only the people I saw every day, who were all white, but through Norman Rockwell images that saturated a 1960s girl's life, and my TV shows. So everywhere I looked, I saw what I thought were just people, but what was really happening in my mind and my belief system was that the idea of all white spaces was being normalized. And then all the behaviors that are typical in all white spaces were normalized.
So by normalized, you mean you just didn't think beyond that scene in your mind. You never said, well, that's strange or that's different or
exactly.
What's really happening, sort of.
Exactly. I didn't question.
Right.
I didn't say, there must be something going on for there to be a town that's all white in a country that is not.
So in school, when you were in school, there was no diversity in your school. It was just pretty homogenous.
Yeah, it was very homogenous.
Interesting. And then you decided to go into a teaching career.
So actually the teaching career came later. I had a whole first career in nonprofit management.
Oh, interesting.
In arts management, yeah. And probably the organization that I worked for that you would know would be First Night, the New Year's Eve celebration.
Right.
And in that capacity, there was a real charge at the time because we did a lot of fundraising, and also First Night partners with 13 or 14 city departments, the police department, the parks department, and so on, and public works, to pull off this massive event. And so there was a lot of pressure or suggestion also from our funders saying, really, this is supposed to be a citywide event, but it's a very white elite event. What can you do? Now, Debbie, you're in this new position to pull together the many neighborhoods of Boston. So suddenly I found myself in neighborhoods that did not look like Winchester or Wellesley, but were really dilapidated and invariably full of black and brown people. And I had no way to make meaning of it other than to fall back on this idea that I'd been exposed a lot to in my childhood, which was America's a level playing field. People in this country, the beauty of this country is that people succeed or fail on their own merit. And so when I applied that thinking to this observation, it led me to believe that these people, they were failing on their own merit, not as opposed to some historical government divisive system along racial lines, which is what I went on to learn what it was. But I didn't know any of that at the time. And so I thought these people were lacking, and I wanted to help and fix. So when I think about my racialized mindset, it wasn't one of hate and bigotry, but it was one of patronizing and pitying, which has a set of problems that I think are as problematic as hateful.
So, and how was that for you? So you exited your Winchester white bubble and you went down to downtown Boston. And did you have to knock on people's doors and get them talking about the organization and participating? How much of an interactive engagement did you have to throw yourself into initially?
Well, I should have thrown myself into it aggressively, and I didn't, because I operated in a paradigm, the paradigm that I had grown up in, which is through delegation. So I was the general manager of the organization, so I immediately hired an outreach coordinator.
Oh, great. Okay.
Another important piece of this story is, so I wasn't just white, but I come from a family with a fair amount of wealth. And so even in Winchester, you know, I would have ended up connected to wealth because of the amount of social capital in a town like that. But so I was very able to raise funds for this new initiative. So one of the first things I did was raise money to hire someone to organize all of that for me. And so I had some exposure to seeing what was going on in these neighborhoods, but I never sat down and said, I've got access to wealth, and I can see that you don't necessarily have that access. I'm wondering how we could, you know, partner together to transfer some of this to you. Like, what programs would you need? Would you even be interested in my help?
Right.
Instead, I assumed my help was needed. I assumed I was entitled to select an outreach coordinator and send her in. So I'm operating through this whole hierarchical way of being in the world.
And is your outreach coordinator also white?
She was a black woman.
Okay.
And she was great. She was great at her job. And yet she could, any person of color who's charged with a diversity effort is greatly limited by the limitations of the people with whom they work within the organization.
Right.
And so she could only do as much as she could do with my blinders and, you know, my lack of seeing.
And that must have been an interesting dynamic and interaction for you. Did you learn a lot from her, from working with her in this context and situation?
I did. I think the biggest learning I had was a jolt, and it was the very last day on the job there. So the reason I ended up leaving first night was because I married a guy who was on the road all the time. He produced the TV show This Old House, and so that show took us on the road, and I was having a baby, and I didn't want to be home with a baby alone. So here I was, very pregnant, in my last meeting. It was in January. We had just had the big first night celebration where all these inner city programs that I had helped fund and organize, the people who had participated in them were coming to downtown Boston. And as I observed the streets of Boston that night, I couldn't believe how diverse it was, how many more black and brown faces were there. And I felt so great about myself for this amazing project I'd put together. In this January meeting, after that night, we go to have a debrief, and some of the families, the students who had come from these after-school programs, and the artists, predominantly white, who had gone in there to help them create art for first night, we were all standing around, and it was intensely awkward and silent, and nobody was really talking. The point of the evening was to say, hey, how'd this go? How can we make this program better? Right. And finally, this one boy who was probably, I'm going to say 10, 11, 12, said, it was freaky. It was scary. I have never seen so many white people in my life.
And that's another good thing for good reason for 10-year-olds to, they tell it like it is.
They do. They do.
Got to have more of those 10-year-olds everywhere you go.
I know, it makes me think of the movie Big, where when Tom Hanks is a little kid, he has a better way of designing the toy. So well, if this little boy, and he wasn't that little, if this kid hadn't said that, and the room had just stayed nice and polite, I don't think any of us would have learned. And that was my last meeting. And so I went into this 2-year period of being a traveling young mother. And I think I thought about that every day. And every time I thought about it, it just gave me this little burst of adrenaline. I knew that I was missing something. Because the truth is, I expected people to come in that day and say, thank you so much for organizing this.
This is so great.
This was so great. We are so thrilled to be included. But I had to really come to terms with the fact, you know, I actually used people to make myself look good. And
it's an interesting perspective.
It was a huge paradigm shift.
Did you feel like, well, that should have been your first day? Then you know, like, well, you get this information on your last day and you think, I'm leaving, so my last day. If I had known this on my first day.
I never had that thought then,
Yeah.
but now that you put
Yeah.
it there, yes. Like, what if
Right.
that meeting had happened before
Right.
the whole thing began?
Right.
As I started out by saying, what if I had this understanding that, wow, I've got access to wealth, and not everybody does.
The next nonprofit job you take on.
Right.
Right.
Oh, I will. I am trying
There you
so
go.
hard not to repeat history.
Put the 10-year-old in there the first day, at the very first meeting.
That's right.
There you go. So
Yeah.
what you think?
Maybe some 5-year-olds too.
There you go. That's a good mix.
Yeah.
Kids are good for that.
They are great.
Well, that's very interesting. And then it was after this, you take a break for a while, having your children, and
Yeah.
then you went back into teaching.
And then, yes, because I realized, so I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and my children were in the Cambridge public schools, at least for their early years. And so I was able to see a really diverse mix of families and children under one school roof. And yet I could still observe that something was happening along racial lines. And so I really wanted to and I just love children. And so I thought, well, why not become a teacher and try to engage around this issue in an environment where, like, the population is already mixed. There's something else going on. Maybe I can figure out what else. And I couldn't figure it out on my own. It took a graduate school course for me to understand what that was.
Oh, interesting. And then you had to go through the whole teacher certification process and program. And
Well, here's the interesting thing. I was not a full-blown teacher. I was an assistant teacher. And for that, you don't need, I'm not even sure you need a college degree.
Right. Because you're actually transitioning careers completely.
Yes,
going
and
into something new after having children.
Yes.
Which is interesting for me, because I talk to a lot of young women and they say that's really hard to have to start your career up all over again after children.
It is. It's really hard, and yet I didn't want to invest the time and money into a graduate school education if it turned out I didn't like teaching.
Right.
So I started off as and they're just 1-year positions, is what's called a paraprofessional, an assistant. And I immediately discovered that I actually loved this position because the lead teacher was often in the back room doing standardized testing,
preparing
with students, and I actually got to spend time with much more time with the students and with the students' families.
You got to engage out in the front of the classroom more.
Yes, and so I really loved the position. But after 4 years of it, I thought, okay, I can go get the degree at night. I can stay in this assistant position. I can get this degree at night. And in 4 years from now, so 8 years in, then I can decide, do I want to be a lead teacher or do I still want to be an assistant? So that was the plan. When I went to graduate school, there was a required first course called Racial and Cultural Identities.
Oh, nice.
Couldn't get any further in the program until you took this entry course.
Right.
And I thought I was going to learn about other cultures and other identities.
Right.
And on the first day, I was a little surprised to learn that the whole semester would be devoted to us, each and every student, doing a deep dive into their own racial and cultural identity.
Right.
Which I, by the way, didn't even know I had one.
Yeah. Yes, I'm not surprised. A lot of people say that. They say, "What? I have a racial and cultural identity?"
Right.
Right. People don't know how to answer. It's like the plastic and paper question in the grocery store. When you ask someone, "Well, what do you identify yourself as?" And it's only when you have to fill out one of those forms, like, pick a race that you are, and people say, "What? I have to pick a race? I don't know how to answer this question."
So, and I of course, I was 48 years old, so I had filled out many a census form or other forms where white was checked.
Right.
But it struck me how it was possible for me to do that again and again and again.
And not really think about what you were checking.
Yes, or what's the impact of that?
Right. What does it mean?
Yeah, what does it mean?
Right. That's so interesting. The second edition of the philosopher Frankl's book just came out, Man's Search for Meaning. And it's interesting. It's and then I talked to Michelle Chalmers, about president of World of Wellesley, about your presentation on waking up white. So we've been having a lot of conversations in Wellesley about the search for meaning and what do things mean and how do they impact people. So this has been a very exciting 2016, to say the least.
5 weeks in.
I think for the whole town.
Yeah.
So and you recently gave this presentation.
Right.
Based on your book, to a Wellesley audience. And how did that go? How was that for you? And you don't have to be as honest as a 10-year-old, but
Oh, that's my whole thing.
maybe a 12-year-old.
Yeah, no, I am a huge believer in just putting it all out there, because you can feel things in the room, and it's only once we make them visible that we can start to work with them. But it's interesting that you talk about the whole idea of meaning making, because the presentation that I gave is one that I've given in many places around the country at this point, and it's called "I'm a Good Person, Isn't That Enough?" And it's all about the way we use what's in our belief systems. And I do this because it's a circular way of thinking. I use what's in my belief system to make meaning of the world around me. And so if my belief system is faulty, which I now understand mine was very full of holes, omissions, errors, and flat out lies, I will make incorrect meaning of the world around me.
Sure. It's logical.
Yes, it is. And a perfect example is the one I gave, where I used the idea of a level playing field to justify my ideas that these people couldn't help themselves. So the talk went really well. It was an overwhelmingly white crowd, which happens a lot of times when I show up. And I think it's sort of fascinating for white people to start to see themselves or a white person speaking to this issue, because there's this huge misperception that race and racism is a problem that was created by and belongs to Black and brown people, when in fact white people invented the whole idea and have used the idea of racial difference to divert resources and rights and even respect disproportionately towards white people through American history.
And in your book, you touch more on case studies or examples from your days teaching rather than your work with nonprofit. Is that fair to say?
I think it's pretty evenly distributed. Yeah.
And what did you learn out of your experience with engaging the students, and what was the age group that you taught?
So I was a K-1-2 teacher, and I spent time in a kindergarten, in a first and in a second grade class. So I love those are my people. And what I learned was that my best intentions were not enough. I can give you a really great concrete example. So I had, in the second grade, there was a student named Rosie who came to our classroom, and she came with a file this thick, which for anyone who's in education, you know that if you have a file that's this thick, it's full of write-ups about bad behavior. There's probably a special ed plan.
So that's your red flag.
This is my red flag, that this is a student that has not been doing well according to the rules of this school. And this was a beautiful, wonderful school. Its motto was, everyone is different, everyone belongs. It was really designed to mainstream children with special needs. But this was a young girl from Haiti, and I knew her because I had met her on the playground, and I was going to be the one that saved her. I was not going to add one piece of paper to that fat file. So we created a behavior plan, and that meant that every day we would agree that she was going to, stick to the tasks at hand. And if she could do it, she would earn a star for doing it at math, a star in art, a star class by class. And if she could get a certain percentage of stars over the course of the day, she'd get a little treasure out of the treasure box. She was psyched. I was psyched. Every day we had this conversation, and hardly ever was she able to do it. She had a habit of getting up and walking away from whatever she was doing. And I would get increasingly frustrated. She would get increasingly frustrated. But the next day, we'd say, today we're going to do it. And it never worked. Finally, in March, so now we're 8 months into the school year? I was in this course, Racial and Cultural Identities, and we start studying how there are cultures, African American communities, Latino communities, in which the collective, operating as one of many, is normalized, whereas in my white world, being a rugged individual had been normalized. Well, the schools are set up in an individual mindset. So I had been expecting her to sit, and all these other teachers, everyone was expecting her to sit on task, do her work. But she wasn't on my mind. I had taken that class the night before, Bennett class the night before. I come in the next day, Rosie and I have our session, and the very first few minutes of math, she gets up. And this time I don't interrupt her. I want to see where she's going. And in my head, I'm thinking this whole collective way of being in the world. She walks over to the far corner of the room where one of her classmates is crying. I had not even noticed that one of my own students was crying, but Rosie did. And Rosie got down and was rubbing her back. Well, it turned out that Kendall, the student that she was going to console, was so frustrated with math.
Right.
And couldn't do this and was feeling terrible about herself around math. So at lunch that day, so I sort of let that go, and Rosie came back to her seat. At lunch that day, I said, I'm thinking that what you were doing was you were going over to help Kendall. Is that why you get up? And she said, yes. And I said, well, how did you even know Kendall was in distress?
Bad shape, right.
And she said, because I could hear her. And it made me realize, now this is a girl who, Rosie is a girl who lived in a very small house, apartment with lots of cousins, slept multiple kids to a bed, which I always thought, oh, that's so terrible, you don't have your own room. Right. Well, in fact, what she was doing was developing a different kind of a skill. Right. Whereas my daughters were developing the skills to be independent, Rosie was developing skills to be highly connected and highly emotive and empathic. And so once I was able to understand not just her culture, but my culture and how they were interacting, we were able to talk about it openly. Right. She had no more awareness of her cultural norms than I had of mine. So, but once we got talking, we were able to say, wow, okay, it is great that you want to help people. Your teacher, I wish I had more of that. Right. And yet we still have to get through the day. Right. So how are we going to do it? And so we designed a whole new behavior system that built in chances for her to connect, to be connected, to work in partnership. And when she did feel the impulse to get up, at least she didn't feel bad about who she was. Right. She wasn't beating herself up.
She doesn't feel like she's getting further away from the treasure.
Yes, right. Right. And no, I'm not a bad person for getting up. I'm a beautiful empathetic person for getting up. And yet right now the job is to complete this.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. What a great story.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's an example.
Oh, right. And so how did this process go for you, that the process of building up to write the book and really share your experiences and talk about these things?
So, so that example, which is more long-winded than I wanted it to be, that example was one of so many that started happening to me, where I realized that I was in the equation. I was a big part of the problem. And not out of any mean-spiritedness. Right. And I realized, wow, this is going on all around me, all around my school, all around the city, all around the country. And not just in schools. The more I started talking to people, friends who worked in healthcare, for instance, or the legal field, I started to realize the same sort of lack of awareness is ubiquitous. Right. Also ubiquitous was lack of historical understanding. Because in that course I was learning a lot of history. And I felt, when the course ended, I felt like, you know what? It was criminal for me to be, or anybody to be put in charge of young children without a better understanding of cultural, social dynamics and historical realities that have gone down in this country. And I wish I'd known. And I think there are a lot of other white people out there who would want to know. I know there's some people for whom this is too traumatic. They can't believe it. But I believed most people would want to know. Right. And
well, for everyone, regardless of their race or their color, just being having that level of self-awareness and asking yourself, what are my norms and who am I? And when I discuss things or address other people, am I making certain assumptions that may be inaccurate?
Right. Yeah.
Just to start out slow with whatever it is that you're doing, because you can't assume that somebody else is on the same page.
Yeah. Yeah, and in there's just this normal, it's a human need to have bias, to be able to discern how to navigate. And yet in this country we've been taught sort of who to fear and what to fear.
Sure.
So that's a piece of it. And so I just had this overwhelming need to share what I had learned. with the anticipation that there would be people out there who would be wanting what I was offering. And the question was then, how do I do that? Well, not everyone's going to sign up for a graduate school course. So I thought, well, I've never written a book, but I've always been told I'm a great letter writer.
Yeah, piece of cake.
Yeah, piece of cake. So I set aside a year
Wow.
to write the book, and it took 4 to do it.
And while you were working and raising your children.
Well, this was the interesting thing. I expected to write it while I was working. Shortly after the course ended, Henry Louis Gates, the incident of Dr. Gates trying to get into his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts after returning from a long trip to China. Do you remember that whole incident?
Right. Yeah.
That blew up, and that was in July, and I had just finished this course in May. And so I was figuring out what am I going to do? How will I write? And that happened, and as I listened to the dialogue through the airwaves, I could tell to a person who had been awakened and understood the historical contexts and who didn't. And I thought, we cannot be having arguments like this in the country. We're not even arguing about the same thing.
Right. There are people who are talking at each other and over each other, and they're not on the same basis to begin with. So.
And the belief systems that they're operating from are full of very different understandings. So my husband and I talked about, could we afford to just have me walk away from my job for a year and do this? Because I'm not sure I want this to drag out. This needs to happen. It needs to happen now. And that was so then I decided to leave my job for a year and defer my graduate school for a year. I never went back to work. I never went back to graduate school because the whole process just pulled me in. The more I met with people, the deeper I understood the problem was, the more I understood I really didn't even know yet what I was talking about. So I had to keep learning.
Right. But the success from walking away from those two things had you produce this wonderful thing.
Yes. And I had a lot of class privilege to be able to do it. And here's an interesting thing about the book is that the book we're looking at now is version 10. Versions 1 through 9 were never published. They were just coming off Staples.
So the 9 drafts.
The 9 drafts were heavily read, and I got in focus groups. So I got a lot of feedback along the way that helped me mitigate the potential damage of doing more harm than good, which is what.
That's a lot of research, not only in the writing, but the accumulating and putting things together and getting feedback while you were writing.
Yeah.
So, and how did you do your focus groups? Is it mostly your community?
Well, the first focus group was my family, and and at that point, I think I had 45 pages written. But I just had to say, "Is this mean anything to you? What do you think of the tone?" And so then that led to version 2, and each time it expanded. Version 6 was read by about 100 people.
Oh, nice.
And 80 of them were white people who were people who I had met, some of them on a plane. If you ever want someone to read your book and give you feedback.
It's a captive audience. Where are they going to go?
That's right. Well, I didn't have the book with them, but they would say to me, if you need some, I want to read your book.
Oh, there you go.
So I had this long list.
Here's chapter 2.
Yes. Oh, no, I sent the whole thing.
Excellent.
But, so I had a long list of people who had identified as white, well-intentioned, but frustrated and confused, about race and racism. And then the other 20 were people who I had met along the way who identified as, racial justice educators, activists, anti-racist activists. So I literally went to Staples and printed out, all of these hard copies. And mailed them all over the place and asked people to write in margins.
Oh, nice.
And then I had, for those who were local, I had a number of dinners where I said, I will give you food and drink if you will come and engage in a discussion.
Very nice.
So that's how that went.
That's a lot of work.
Yes.
And now you're on a book tour. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that safe to say?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't think of it as a book tour anymore. I feel like I'm a racial justice educator, and this is one of my tools.
It's a diversity road trip.
Yes, right. Yes, yeah.
Awesome. So where have you been recently in the last few months?
I've been to Baltimore and St. Louis, which both brought me in after the riots. And I spent a fair amount of time on multiple engagements at both places. I've been to Williams College, I've been to UVA, I've been to a number of private schools, I've been to a lot of faith organizations, some Jewish communities, many more Christian, like Quaker, Protestant, the Unitarian Universalist communities around the country are really embracing this work. And the way it looks in most places that I go is that a community, be it a institution of higher education, a private school, a public school district, a faith community, or a town, as with Wellesley, has used my book as a community-wide read. And then I come in after to kind of unpack all that further.
So tell us about the discussion, the unpacking process here in Wellesley. How was that? How was that for you? What were your thoughts on the aftermath?
You know, I've yet to show up where I don't walk away just wowed by the ability of white people many white communities, people who live in white communities, are explicitly taught that talking about race is taboo. So when I show up and it's a predominantly white crowd, we're now talking about asking people to publicly ask questions and speak to an issue that they have been taught not to speak about. And we always have to cut it off. Nobody wants to stop talking. I feel like it is a bottled up conversation everyone's dying to have. So, for instance, some of the questions I usually get are, how is your family dealing with this? You know, have they come along with you? And in there I hear, I want to do something, but I'm afraid I'm going to lose my family. It's a big fear in white communities. I didn't get that question in Wellesley. I did get the question, and I get this one a lot, what do people of color think about the work you're doing? How have they responded? I got the question, what can we do in schools? What can we do in our curriculums to present a broader history and a broader understanding of what this issue is? And I got the question, why is this so much more entrenched than the kind of progress, because we're seeing so much progress around gender and homophobism and sexism. You know, why does racism seem to be so entrenched? So those are sort of the three big questions that I'm thinking that were on Wellesley's mind. And we had a lot of conversation about all of it. One of the high points for me is that there were two young people in the audience, two high school students in the audience who were quite aware, and that, you know, here they were on I think it was a Thursday night. They were here on a school night on a Thursday night with their parents, both of them, you know, for 2 hours listening to me talk. So both of them were able to speak to what they are learning in school. And one was a young man and one was a young woman. The young woman was particularly, I think it was newer information for her, and she was pretty shaken. And I was overjoyed to see that her parents were there, literally sitting, I think they were sitting on either side of her, but they came up to me afterwards and said, we are working so hard to catch up with where she is so we can support her. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges in this work, is that younger people are really leaning in, to use an overused, but it's a good term. They are leaning in and saying, wait, like, how could this be happening in my country? And parents don't have the skills, and a lot of times they don't have the interest in having this conversation. And it puts young people in a terrible position, because schools to provide a 21st century education have got to be tackling these issues. It's happening all over college campuses. And what a position for a young person to be in, to be learning one thing at school and to go home and have parents deny that what they're learning in school is happening.
It's not important to have a discussion over that over dinner, but we'd like to talk about how you did in social studies today. Because that takes precedence over your very soft discussions on diversity that we can talk about later on the weekend or something.
And here we have young people trying so hard to make meaning of an incredibly complex world that happens to feel really scary right now.
Right. Yeah.
And so I am now, I'm an adult educator. My work is with adults to help adults catch up
Right.
to the younger generation who is so ready to be having this understanding become deeper, more nuanced, and more complex,
Right.
because that matches what the world really looks like.
Right. Right. Well, that's so interesting. So, give me an example, if possible, of something that stayed with you from the discussion here in Wellesley last week. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah,
but
well, there's so much that
I know, I'm
stays
sure.
that stays with me.
something in particular, just one case study that remained with you.
I really think it is the young man who was able to speak, and by the way, he's not in the Wellesley Public Schools, he's at Beaver Country Day School, which is doing a very good job of this.
Speaking about diversity and
Yes, and walking the talk.
Right.
So he was able to speak beautifully to the curriculum, and yet who was not in the room were there wasn't a balance of, I would have liked to have had many young people in the room, and including students of color, because there is only one kind of a person who can really tell any community how well they're doing on the racial justice front, and those are the people of color. And we did have one young man of color who spoke to his experience at Wellesley High School, and yet I would have loved to have been able to ask what wasn't able to happen because there weren't enough families or students of color, is I wasn't able to say, on a scale of 1 to 10, what grade would you give Wellesley, Massachusetts, in meeting its ideals?
Right.
So what's most memorable actually is who wasn't in the room and the conversation that couldn't happen because of that.
Oh, interesting. That's a very interesting perspective. And so, where are you next? What's next on your agenda with the book and the travels and the conversations?
It's funny because my introduction invariably includes the words "her first book," and I'm not sure there will be a second book. I feel like what I'm doing. I have a mentor, a gentleman named Dr. Eddie Moore Jr., and who's founded the White Privilege Conference 17 years ago. And he said, I think this is a project, and the book is kind of launched the project. And so I'm thinking of it in those terms. I really want to create a webinar series. I really want to address how do we handle this classroom to kitchen table disconnect with some sort of how do we educate parents so that there isn't that tension. I have so many projects I want to do. I've developed a number of workshops, cross-racial workshops, a black, white women workshop. And so for me, it's really learning to balance my time. I want to continue to go around and speak. I want to continue to write a blog. I'm starting to do video blogs, and yet I need to also find time to build in some new projects, because I am every single day.
Right.
I learn something new and astounding about my own blind spots.
It's interesting. You need a clone.
I do.
Yes, either that or a wife.
Yeah, every woman needs a wife.
That's true.
Yeah.
And while I have you here, I would love to have you autograph my book. So
I would love to autograph
my copy
your
of the book. So please,
Okay.
and we'll make it official. So
Okay.
have you signing the book. Well, I've heard a lot of good feedback. There are many people who enjoyed reading and discussing with you. So it's really just an honor and a privilege to have you visit and come to town and lead the discussion.
Well, thank you. And it's great to have a book. It's great to have a community talk about it, but being able to also have our conversation captured and made even more widely available is great, because the message just needs to get out into the world.
Right. It's good to have it's good to keep the dialogue going.
Yes,
as they say.
definitely. Thank you so much
And
for
thank
having
you.
me on.
Very welcome. We'll have to
Okay.
have you come back after your national tour, 2017. We'll have to make an appointment for you to come back and give us feedback on how it's been going.
Oh, it's a date.